First of all, I just wanted you all to know that I've been reading Let's Not Meet for a while now. I never posted anything myself, but I do have something that I'd like to share that still creeps me out just thinking about it. I'm from Sweden and English is not my native tongue, so please forgive me if my grammar isn't 100% correct. This happened a few years ago when I had just finished high school. I had just moved to a new town where I started working at a video game store in a mall a bit outside of town. It was really fun at first. I loved talking about games and met a lot of customers who I had a lot of really nice conversations with about games all day long. It really seemed like a dream job for a game nerd like me. Since I'm a female, I often had to deal with people being really questioning about my actual interest in video games. Sigh. But most of our customers were really friendly and non-prejudiced, which made working even more fun. Until one day. Our store had a lot of regulars, and I soon started to recognize almost every one of them. Most of them were just regular people coming in to pre-book some games or have a nice chat for a bit while looking through our new releases, while some of them were a bit more odd. I didn't really pay much attention to the odd ones. They didn't really do anything besides acting a bit weird, asking weird questions and stuff. One of the odd ones usually came in every day to help me sort all games in alphabetical order, which made me glad. I often had to run the store all by myself and had little time to do that kind of work between customers, unpacking boxes, and all the store marketing. He didn't really speak much, but I'm a very social person, and naturally I talked a lot to him and made a lot of jokes, which he seemed to appreciate in his own quiet way, like it was uncommon for him to have someone to talk to him at all. I thought he seemed nice, and assumed that he just had a hard time socializing with people, so I tried my best to win his trust, and to not say anything that would make him uncomfortable. But one day, he started to act a bit more weird than usual. It was a regular day at work, and the guy came in as usual, asking if I needed help with anything. I appreciated his offer, but gladly declined, and said that I had everything under control. As I started my daily routine in the store, marketing new releases, cleaning the floors, etc., I started to notice that the guy was following me around. He was really quiet, and every time I turned around, or noticed that he was staring at me, he looked away instantly. I didn't really think much about it at that point. I had too much work to do, and kept on doing my routines and dealing with other customers. But he kept following me around, always staring right at me. After a couple of hours, I noticed he was still around. I guess I'd been too busy to notice him, but he was still in the store and still staring at me. I was about to close up when he started asking some really weird questions, like where I lived, if I had a boyfriend, what my full name was, and if he could add me as a friend on Facebook. I declined, telling him we had a strict policy at work not to add customers as friends on Facebook, which I faked. There really isn't any policy. I just didn't know what to say, and his questions started to make me feel really uncomfortable. I told him politely that I had to close up the store. He nodded and started to walk away, slowly, turning around every now and then to see if I was still watching him. I closed up, went home, and didn't really think much about it. I told my current boyfriend at that time about the guy and his strange behavior. He sat quiet for a bit, but after a while, we both agreed that it really wasn't anything weird going on, and we both went to sleep. The next day seemed like any other day at work. I had just started doing my daily routines when the guy showed up again. I said hi, trying to sound as positive as possible, but he didn't answer me. He just quietly started to sort our games in alphabetical order, like he usually does. But I noticed that he was always keeping an eye on me. At this point, I actually started to freak out a bit, but luckily, it was a Saturday and I had a lot of customers, so I was never alone in the store. The day went on really quick, and when it was time to close up, there he was again, right in front of me. This time, he wasn't really as quiet as usual, though. He started to ask for my full name again and demanded that I would add him as a Facebook friend. I once again declined, and that's when he started to become a bit more threatening. He told me that he needed my address and said that he needed to know exactly where I lived, which I refused to answer. He was getting really angry and told me that it didn't matter, that he would find me anyway, that he would follow me home and get into my apartment when I least expected it. I started shaking while he was screaming at me, when finally 2 guards doing their routine stroll around the mall came by and asked if everything was okay. The guy became nervous and ran away, and I said that everything was fine. He just seemed a bit odd, that's all. Even though I was still shaking, I didn't want to make a big scene about it. I just wanted to get home as soon as possible. I closed up again and headed outside when I saw him again. There he stood, right outside the mall, waiting for me. I felt every single hair on my body suddenly rising, but I kept my head high and walked right past him, like I haven't even noticed him. He started to call for me. "Hey you, stop right now, I just want to talk." And when I turned around, I noticed that he was following me. I started to walk even faster, even more scared, and went down to the subway. He was still following me. I waited for a couple of minutes and glanced at him every other second. As he stood about 10 to 13 feet away from me, always staring right at my face. He went on the same subway as me, and I could almost feel my heartbeat in my mouth. What was the matter with this guy? What did he want? I really didn't even want to know. I just wanted to get home without him following me. I texted my boyfriend that I was followed, and he told me to get off at the station before mine, and that he'd meet me there. I did as he said, still watching every move that guy made. The subway stopped and I went off, as did the guy. I went up the escalators and noticed that he was running towards me. I started to run as well, as fast as I could, up the escalators, where I finally saw my boyfriend waiting for me. As soon as we met up, the guy froze still, turned around, and started to run away. Just like when the guards at the mall approached us. My boyfriend tried to calm me down as we walked home, but I just couldn't get the guy's creepy stare out of my mind. Let's just say I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I called my boss and explained what happened, and he told me to stay home for a couple of days, which I gladly did. My boyfriend was furious with hatred against this guy. Who knows what could have happened if I had walked home alone that night? It gave me shivers just thinking about it, and thinking about getting back to work and seeing him and his eyes staring at me again. I almost couldn't handle it. A couple of days later, my boyfriend sat me down by the kitchen table. His facial expression was totally serious. He held my hand, looked deep into my eyes, and told me that I never, ever had to be afraid to go to work again. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and said that it all was taken care of, and that I didn't have to worry about it. I couldn't get anything out of him, but just as he had said, when I got back to work, the guy wasn't there. Not that day, or the next day, or the day after that. It was almost like he had disappeared. I didn't ask my boyfriend until years later about that guy again, and what he had actually meant when he said that it was all taken care of. He didn't want to tell me at first, but after I'd begged him for a while, he finally cracked. I think it's accurate to mention that my boyfriend had been involved with some kind of gang before meeting me. I don't know much about it. He told me that after I first told him about the first incident at work, he had contacted some of his former friends and asked them to track down this guy, and they had found out that this particular guy had been following and raping women around town for a long time before I even got to know him. The reason he had kept this from me was because he didn't want me to be more scared than I already was, but he assured me that he had been taken care of and that I never had to be afraid again. I never asked him about what happened again after that, but just thinking about it still gives me shivers. I wonder how many girls before me were a victim to this guy. I wonder what he did to them, and I wonder what happened to him. The only thing I know is that I never saw his face again, and you know what? I'm really glad I didn't.
Back in my early 20s, I worked at an adult novelty store. I was used to creepers and not much fazed me at this point in my brief employment. A typical day consisted of an array of colorful people, all of which I'm sure would make great entries, especially the geriatric men that would come in and act like they had bad eyesight and have me read the directions on the back of the penis enhancement creams to get cheap thrills. Gross, I know. After a while, you just learn how to deal with these people and make them move on. Applying for this job, I was naive to the extent of the nut jobs I would have before me. This job was actually very character building in many ways. Enough about that. This particular day, I was working an all-day Sunday shift. Normal to have but a handful of customers. I was camped out in my desk chair inside the circle counter in the middle of the store watching my Golden Girls box set on the television that hung above me. Typical Sunday. I'm assuming it was nearly 1 p.m. at the time. I happened to look out the glass store window to see a red pickup pull into a parking space way far back in the lot. Strange. There were no cars but mine parked out front. The store was completely isolated except for a 7-Eleven caddy corner separated by an alleyway. I was all alone. I see a skinny guy get out and starts to slowly make his way to the storefront. He comes in, I greet him, and he just stands there. I turn away from him, enough to keep him in my peripheral, then he slowly proceeds towards me. He makes his way up to the counter and I'm now facing him. He had bloodshot, watery eyes, dressed in baggy clothes and a cap. He hands me a wad of dirty crumpled money and says in a monotone voice, "I found this in the parking lot. I want to give it to you in case someone wants to reclaim it." I said for him to keep it. He did not bend over in the lot to pick anything up on his way to the store. I also found it strange that he parked so far away. I was onto him but already getting creeped. I just wanted him to go away. He gave me a sick feeling. Considering the clientele, this was a big deal. He told me to take the money several times and he was so persistent. Wanting him to just get the hell out, I took the money. He then said to me, "Whatever you do, don't give it back to me." I said, "Okay." He starts to slowly walk out, and just as he reaches the door, and I'm about to sigh my breath of relief, he turns and inches his way back towards me. "Can I have that money back?" he asks. "I thought you said you didn't want it," I replied. "I don't," he said. "Okay, I'll keep it here for safekeeping." This went on for a few solid minutes. I knew I was dealing with a real piece of work and he kept trying to get behind me, and I was wheeling around in a circle so I could face him at all times. His eyes were so intense and fixated on me the entire time. When he finally left, I was shaken because he was so eerie. I looked down at the filthy, tattered, crumpled money and counted out 6 $1 bills. What the hell? I thought. But I shook it off as another day in the life at the sex shop. A couple of hours go by, and I had swept all the previous weirdness under the rug. It was a slow day, and the store was dead. Then, lo and behold, in he slowly walked. Again. My heart sinks. I grab my phone. He walks up to me and asks if anyone had come in to claim the money. I say no, and point to the money on the counter. Believe me when I say I did not want this money for myself. He then asks for it back. I said that I thought he told me not to give it back. I felt like this was some weird, sick game I was involved in, and his character was so off-putting and unpredictable I felt like I really needed to play along. He then proceeds to beg me for the money, saying he needed it really bad. I broke. I hand it to him. His eyes burn into mine, his face expressionless and voice flat. I told you not to give it back. I froze up. We just stared at each other, and I was picturing gravestones in my head. It felt like eternity. Then a couple walk in. That's when he grabs the $6 and leaves. I'm pretty sure something bad would have gone down if people hadn't come in. He never lunged at me, but there was something sinister about him. I told my coworker shortly after. She said it happened to another girl that worked there too, but he didn't stick around because there was 2 people working. A completely different type of freak than I was used to. I had another creepy incident with a man pleasuring himself in front of the glass windows at night after I had locked the doors. That one I had no questions to involve the police, and I quit. That was a weird little moment of my life. I have several stories I'd like to put on here. This is a good tame one for me to break ice. Creepy menacing guy with $6. Let's not meet again. Never.
I'm a 26-year-old female who's about 5 foot nothing and generally harmless looking. I have no idea what it is about being seemingly harmless, but it tends to attract a whole array of bad news. Don't believe me? Go ask a soft-spoken tiny girl who gives you the first impression of, "Isn't she just adorable?" And more than likely, she'll have enough stories to make you worry about your sanity. This is compounded by my overall attitude of, I'll be sugar, rainbow, and sunshine right up until you give me a reason not to. A job in retail makes the whole mess about as fun as bamboo splinters under your fingernails. Whoever came up with the idea the customer is always right needs to be shot, resurrected, and shot again. That said, I'll do anything within the limits of my job for a customer. I like helping customers out. Most retail workers do. A little lesson is to be had here for those who have never worked in a service-based company. Most employees want to help you. Let them, and you'll both walk away from the encounter in a much better frame of mind. If they don't, you should ask yourself if it's a situation beyond their control. If the answer is even anywhere close to it might be, let them off the hook. I've seen too many retail employees get a look of dread on their face when something goes wrong as I, myself, am out being a customer. It bothers me every single time because I know what it's like to think, great, now I'm gonna get yelled at and called names for something that isn't my fault. Or if they're mad enough, they might even call in about me and then my boss will be wondering what in God's name I'm doing. You know what said employee can do about it? Sit there and take it, while apologizing for your inconvenience. But I digress. I work as an overnight supervisor to a 24-hour drugstore. We get plenty of creepy people in, being a fair-sized city with only 2 24-hour pharmacies in town. I have some really weird stories. Maybe I'll tell a few more at a later date. The evening of this particular incident had me working on a Saturday night with 2 other front-end employees. Saturday nights mean ad tags. We overnighters, the few, the lucky, are the ones stuck with this joyful job. It means 10 hours of monotony and a lot of back and forth around the store. Usually the nights pass with some regulars and some meth heads drunks, some regular meth heads drunks, and the occasional sick person or person with a sick loved one at home. Most intoxicated persons are in and out like a flash. But I've noticed, the more out of their wits they are, the higher the potential for creepy is. So you learn to watch the ones with nervous twitches. It was about 1:30 a.m. when this taller, wiry man walked into my store. His brown hair was cropped pretty short, and he was dressed fairly casually. I didn't even realize his presence in the store until the cashier for the night, Daniel, came up to me and muttered something about the weird guy wandering around the front of the store. Daniel is middle-aged, but mischievous and crotchety are two very apt descriptions of him. You never quite know when he's just stirring the pot, so I searched the guy down to see what was bothering Daniel. I'd been thinking it was more than likely he'd noticed something strange about the guy and was worried about shoplifting. This would not be the first or last time his so-called shoplifter turned out to be some poor, exhausted father or husband sent out to get cold medicine. I found him pacing along the front wall and asked if he needed any help in my cheeriest customer service voice. The moment he turned around, I froze. This man radiated subdued violence. It surrounded him like an aura of menace. I couldn't pinpoint what was bothering me. The weirdly still expression, maybe? Or the way he was standing. He was unnaturally tense during my whole experience with him, like he was ready to go off at the first provocation. Truthfully, I still haven't quite figured it out, but he was just off enough to send up red flags just looking at him. Immediately uncomfortable, I was all too happy when he muttered, "No, I'm, just looking." I never have figured out how to gracefully exit the situation when a customer has nothing left to say to you but still stands there, staring, which feels almost expectant, even if it's not. After a minute or so of avoiding meeting his eyes, I told him my usual line of, "All right, well, let us know if you need anything." I backed into the aisle I'd emerged from and hurried off to busy myself with more ad tags. Daniel could keep an eye on him if he felt like it. Dude was scary, and I was the only female on shift. No thank you, they don't pay me enough. It's not long before I start to feel like I'm being watched, and creepy suspect number 1 is lurking at the top of the aisle, staring. I finish all of the tags in line for that aisle, and I'm relieved when I have to move across the store for others in a different section. Again, a few moments passed, and that weird prickly feeling hits me, and he's at the end of the aisle, staring right at me. I ask for the second time if I can help him find anything, and he pretends to busy himself with some vitamins he picked up at random. He gave me a creepy grin and told me again that he was just looking. Yeah, sure, I just bet you were. This continues for another half hour or so, until I find myself heading up to the front to ring up a customer. I had no idea where Daniel was, but it didn't matter. I was grateful for the distraction. That was, until I noticed Creeper following me up to the register, still staring. I conducted the transaction as quickly as possible, and after a few too many nervous glances in my creepy's direction, the customer took off like someone had lit him on fire. I decided to go outside for my lunch break. It was cold, and I thought maybe, since Mr. Creeper didn't have a particularly warm-looking coat on, he'd leave me alone. I searched out one of my coworkers and let them know my intentions, clocked out, and stepped outside and into my car. Now, normally, I try to avoid smoking in my car. I've never liked the way it stinks up a car, but desperate times, desperate measures. I lock the car doors and roll down the window just far enough to fit my cigarette through to ash it. I picked up a book, turned to the page I'd left off on, and settled in. A few paragraphs later, I heard someone banging on my window. I jumped and looked up. Guess who? That's right, Mr. Creepy. He grinned at me in what I'm sure was supposed to be a sheepish fashion, but it came out more Norman Bates, if you know what I mean. I again asked him if I could help him, and he said he'd been looking for something in particular that he'd like my help with. I told him firmly that there were 2 other employees in the store that would have to help him. I was off the clock. He frowned, and after a moment of me pointedly ignoring him in favor of tensely not being able to concentrate on my book, he went back inside. My lunch break ended, and I still hadn't seen him come back out. I hurried inside, clocked in, and called the other shift supervisor, Mark, into the office. I explained the situation and asked him if he could go deal with the dude. Mark sighed, nodded, and went to talk to the guy. I busied myself in the office with some training sessions I'd been putting off for a while. Mark came back inside the office wearing a very bewildered look. I raised an eyebrow and he sat down. That guy was really weird. Weird is not quite the adjective I'd use. What did he say? He wanted to talk to you again. I told him you had other things you needed to be doing, but I'd be happy to help him. That agitated him. You thought he was freaky beforehand. He visibly shuddered, and I raised an eyebrow again. He asked if I knew what time you got off, or where you lived. What the fuck? Exactly. I told him we were legally obligated not to share such information, and that if he wasn't going to buy anything, he needed to leave. Then he left. I followed him out just in case. He was looking around your car until he noticed I had followed, and then he got in his car and left. I decided I wasn't going to stick around to see if he was going to come back, and noped out of the rest of my shift. Shortly after, my store set up a guard contract with the local police department, and I haven't seen him since.
This happened when I was in high school, maybe between my freshman and sophomore years, so 2005-ish. I was on my way home from school. I had about a 1 to 2 hour more ride home on the bus, 2 to 3 buses depending on the day and traffic flow. Sometimes I'd fall asleep and just nearly managed to wake up before my stop. At the time, I lived in the suburbs, about 5 to 10 miles south of Chicago and from my high school. This day, it was 4 or 5 p.m., because that was usually about the time I'd be walking or getting home. I know that it was quite dark and kind of chilly outside, being that the clocks had been set an hour ahead for the fall/winter months. I was on my third and final bus, and I was approaching my stop. I got off, and I started walking home from the bus stop, which was about 2, almost 3 blocks from my building. In the suburbs, the streetlights are spread out a little more than the city, and it's much quieter. There's less traffic on the streets and the sidewalks. On this night, the streetlight closest to my stop was out, unfortunately, so I hated getting off during the fall and winter at this stop, virtually walking almost half of this residential block or more in darkness pretty much. So I'm about half down the first block when this unmarked white van pulled up beside me, still moving, and the passenger opens the side door. I can't remember what he said exactly. It was something along the lines of, "Hey sweetheart, do you need a ride?" I said, "No thank you," and I kept walking, but a little bit faster. I naturally walk fast, so I was damn near about to break into a small jog. I remember a sinking feeling in my stomach because they were not leaving me alone. I continued to walk in an effort to enforce that I wasn't interested in whatever they wanted. They continued to ride slowly beside me with the side door open, speeding up a little as I attempted to do the same thing. I walked ahead a little faster, looking around my surroundings to see if there was someone I could signal to or alert with a scream or something, since this was just before I had a cell phone that was consistently on and available for use. Luckily, for me, I believe a car was turning onto the same block going in the opposite direction, and because this street is residential and two-way, it was fairly narrow, so they were forced to keep driving. I kept looking left to right and behind me to make sure they didn't follow me home, and I proceeded to open my apartment screen door in record timing. Creepy guys in the unmarked white van, let's not meet again.
This happened 2 years ago, and I can't believe I still work there after this horrifying experience. Maggie and I, and a few other employees, were folding panties and organizing bras when a couple women in their later 20s strolled in. They had a shady vibe about them that made me nervous. They both were wearing sunglasses, and it was 8 o'clock at night, which seemed off to me. Like they didn't want to be noticed or identified. We work at Victoria's Secret, so we always have to keep an eye out for thieves, since our items are so expensive and valuable. One of the women who walked in looked to be about 8 months pregnant and was browsing through one of our panty tables when it appeared to us that she was stuffing items in her bag. Maggie and I walked closer to her, without looking too obvious, and we watched as she seemed to be sneaking panties in her shirt. That's when I realized she was sticking them up in her belly. She was wearing a strap-on belly and lifting it just enough to stick them in it. It must have been hollowed out. As I went to find a manager, Maggie spoke in the headset that the girl was now going over to one of the bra sections and hiding behind a rack of clothes. That's when I hear it. "Hey bitch, are you talking about me? You think I'm stealing, don't you?" Maggie froze in fear and assured her she wasn't talking about her. The pregnant girl kept yelling about how we were racist against black people and how we always only think black people steal. My manager then walked over to calm the situation while calling security just in case it got violent. Unfortunately, we constantly deal with customers stealing, which is a real nuisance, but we aren't allowed to confront them for safety reasons. We have to call the mall cops, and then they have to call the real cops to come, which can take a while. And since the mall was closing soon, they just made them leave the mall. You might be wondering why they don't search the ladies. Mall cops are different than real officers and are prohibited from searching anyone unless they actually see someone stealing themselves. So, security came and escorted the pregnant lady and her friend to one of the exit doors, and then came back to make sure we were okay. We were fine and thought it was over, but come to find out we were wrong. Maggie and I were off at 9, so we clocked out and walked out of the store talking about how awkward that was, and how clever but weird it was that she was wearing a fake belly. It's so scary and disturbing the lengths people will go to steal merchandise. That's when we hear, "That's them!" Maggie and I look behind us and see the pregnant girl and her friend with 3 big black guys. One of them is carrying a knife and they start sprinting at us. They yelled a bunch of profanity at us and threatening that we were going to be sorry for what we did. Maggie and I start booking it as fast as we can to our cars, which were parked close to each other, while screaming in fear. Thankfully, they were far enough away that we were able to get to our cars and drive off before they got us. They definitely had a grudge against us for the store incident, and they wanted to hurt us. While driving fast, I made sure I was not being followed, since that group of people were extremely mad and crazy for wanting to potentially kill us over stolen underwear. We told security the next day, and our manager and security reviewed the cameras, but could not identify them, unfortunately. Now, every time I leave work, I leave with multiple people and check the whole area before walking to my car. I also now own mace. Since this event, we have remodeled our store and installed cameras, so if we suspect them stealing, We can look on the cameras, and if the camera captures it, we can keep them in our store until the cops come to arrest them.